The rooftop of Hawthorne Aerospace buzzed with applause as executives, investors, and reporters gathered around the company's newest helicopter. Cameras flashed from every angle, capturing the moment that would celebrate CEO Evelyn Carter's latest multi-million-dollar success. Evelyn stood confidently beside the sleek black and white aircraft, wearing an elegant ivory suit that matched the prestige of the event. At only 32, she had built one of America's fastest-growing aviation companies, and everyone admired her fearless confidence. She smiled as another investor praised her achievement. "Beautiful machine," he said. "It is," Evelyn replied proudly, "but flying it takes more than confidence." The crowd laughed. At the edge of the helipad, a man quietly pushed a yellow cleaning cart, wiping away dust left by the morning preparations. Hardly anyone noticed him. His faded Navy maintenance uniform identified him as one of the building's janitors. His name tag simply read, Daniel. Most people walked past him without a second glance. He kept his head down, calmly polishing the glass safety railing while executives celebrated only a few feet away. One careless employee accidentally knocked over a coffee cup. Without complaint, Daniel stepped forward, picked it up, cleaned the spill, and quietly returned to work. Not one person thanked him. Evelyn noticed. She walked toward him with a playful smile that quickly caught everyone's attention. "So," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "tell me something." Daniel looked up politely. "Yes, ma'am." She pointed toward the helicopter. "Ever flown one of those?" A few executives chuckled. Daniel glanced at the aircraft for only a second. "I've spent some time around helicopters." His calm answer made several people laugh even harder. One investor whispered, "He's probably talking about sweeping around them." More laughter followed. Evelyn folded her arms. "Well," she looked directly into his eyes, "if you can fly that helicopter." She paused just long enough for every phone camera to turn toward them. "I'll marry you." The rooftop exploded with laughter. Some guests clapped. Others pulled out their phones, convinced they were about to record the most embarrassing moment of the day. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't look offended either. He simply looked at the helicopter again, for a brief second. Something changed in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't excitement, it looked like memory. Then he quietly asked, "Are you serious?" That question made everyone laugh even louder. Evelyn grinned. "As serious as someone can be when making an impossible offer." Daniel nodded once. "Then I'd like to know one thing first." Her smile faded slightly. "What?" He looked at the helicopter with calm precision. "Has anyone checked the left hydraulic pressure since it landed?" The laughter stopped. Several engineers exchanged confused glances. No one had mentioned the helicopter's inspection. No one outside the flight crew should have known anything about its hydraulic system. One senior mechanic frowned. How would a janitor even know to ask that? Daniel said nothing. He simply waited for an answer, and for the very first time that afternoon, CEO Evelyn Carter felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. She had just challenged the one man on the rooftop whose past no one could imagine. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then one of the mechanics forced a laugh. "That's just a lucky guess." Several people nodded, eager to believe it. Evelyn crossed her arms again. "You've been cleaning this building for 6 months," she said. "Now you're telling me you know something my engineering team doesn't." Daniel didn't react to the sarcasm. He looked toward the helicopter one more time. "I didn't say I knew more than your engineers." His voice remained calm. "I simply asked a question." An older maintenance supervisor stepped forward. His name was Frank. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing. He looked at Daniel carefully. "Why the left hydraulic system?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because the aircraft leaned slightly when it touched down." Frank frowned. "Could have been the wind." Daniel nodded. "Maybe." He didn't argue. He didn't try to prove himself. That bothered Frank more than confidence would have. A young engineer rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous." He pulled out his tablet. "We inspected the helicopter before landing." Daniel politely asked, "Did you inspect it after landing?" Nobody answered. The engineer's confidence faded just a little. Frank finally turned toward his crew. "Humor me." One mechanic sighed. "You can't be serious." Frank didn't smile. "Go check." Within seconds, 2 mechanics climbed into the helicopter. The rooftop crowd slowly returned to talking. Most people believed this little distraction would end with everyone laughing at the janitor. Evelyn certainly expected that. She walked closer to Daniel. "You know," she said quietly. "You could have just admitted you were joking." Daniel smiled politely. "I wasn't." She studied him. There was something unusual about him. Most people became nervous around wealthy executives. Some tried too hard to impress. Others apologized for simply existing. Daniel did neither. He stood with perfect posture. His breathing never changed. His hands were rough from work, but strangely steady, almost disciplined. Evelyn couldn't explain why that bothered her. So she asked, "Where did you learn all this?" Daniel shrugged. "Life teaches different people different things." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm willing to give." Before she could respond, one of the mechanics suddenly shouted from inside the cockpit, "Frank." Everyone turned. The mechanic climbed halfway out of the helicopter. His face had completely changed. "You need to see this." Frank hurried over. The crowd watched as the engineers whispered among themselves. Another mechanic grabbed a pressure gauge, then another. Within moments, 3 engineers were standing around the landing gear. Nobody laughed anymore. Finally, Frank looked back toward Daniel. Hydraulic pressure dropped almost 15%. The rooftop became silent again. "If we'd sent this helicopter back into the air," he continued, "the pilot would have been forced into an emergency landing." A reporter lowered his camera. An investor whispered, "How in the world?" Evelyn stared at Daniel. "You knew." Daniel shook his head. "No. I suspected. That's impossible." "Nothing is impossible if you've seen enough machines." She took another step toward him. "You keep talking like you've spent years around helicopters." Daniel gave a small smile. "I have." One executive laughed nervously. "What were you?" "A mechanic." Daniel looked at him. "For a while." Another investor joined in. "And before that?" Daniel was quiet, just long enough to make everyone curious. "I had another job." "What job?" Daniel looked toward the city skyline stretching across the horizon. It was a long time ago. His answer only made everyone more curious. At that exact moment, a luxury black SUV pulled onto the rooftop elevator platform. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. Both wore government security badges. The older of the two looked around the rooftop, until his eyes landed on Daniel. For a brief second, the man's expression froze, then without saying a word, he walked straight toward the janitor. The crowd instinctively moved aside. When he stopped in front of Daniel, he stood perfectly straight. Then he quietly said words that left everyone confused. "Sir, we finally found you." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, almost as if he had hoped this day would never come. The rooftop fell silent. Dozens of executives, investors, and reporters watched as the government official stood in front of the building's janitor. No one understood what they were seeing. The older man, dressed in a dark navy suit, didn't look at anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel. "Sir," he repeated respectfully, "Washington has been trying to reach you for almost 3 years." A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. "Washington?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "I changed my number." The official almost smiled. "We noticed." Even Evelyn couldn't hide her confusion anymore. "Excuse me," she interrupted. "Who exactly are you?" The official finally turned toward her. "I'm sorry, ma'am." He reached into his jacket and displayed a federal identification badge. "My name is Richard Hayes, Senior Liaison for the National Aviation Safety Board." Several reporters instantly lifted their cameras. One whispered, "NTSB." Richard nodded politely. "Yes." Now everyone was paying attention. Evelyn looked from Richard to Daniel. "What does this have to do with my janitor?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "Your janitor?" "Yes." For a moment, Richard didn't know whether to laugh or apologize. He turned back toward Daniel. "So, this is what you've been doing." Daniel simply nodded. "It's peaceful." Richard sighed. "I should have guessed." The crowd became even more confused. Peaceful? What kind of man walked away from whatever Richard was talking about just to clean office buildings? Evelyn stepped closer. "I think someone owes us an explanation." Daniel remained silent. Richard looked at him. "Do you want me to tell them?" Daniel answered softly, "It doesn't matter anymore." Richard faced the crowd. "You all know him as Daniel." He paused, "But 15 years ago." Captain Daniel Brooks was considered one of the finest helicopter pilots the U.S. Army had ever trained. The rooftop became completely still. Someone dropped a phone. An executive whispered, "No way." Richard continued. He completed over 200 combat rescue missions. He flew into storms other pilots avoided. He evacuated civilians after hurricanes. He rescued firefighters trapped by wildfires. He brought wounded soldiers home when everyone else believed it was impossible. Every sentence made the silence heavier. Frank, the maintenance supervisor, slowly looked back at Daniel. So that's why. Daniel didn't respond. Richard smiled faintly. The army called him. He stopped, almost as if remembering something painful. The ghost pilot. One of the reporters immediately asked, "Why have we never heard of him?" Richard's smile disappeared. Because he never wanted anyone to. Daniel lowered his eyes. "Richard, please." Richard nodded apologetically. "I'm sorry." But the reporters had already surrounded them. Questions came from every direction. "Captain Brooks, why are you working as a janitor? Did you really fly combat missions? Why leave the military? Were you decorated? Did you lose your license?" Daniel answered none of them. Instead, he quietly picked up his mop. The reporters stared. He began wiping the same section of floor he'd been cleaning before any of this started, as though nothing had happened. That simple act stunned everyone more than Richard's speech. Evelyn couldn't stop watching him. She had expected pride, maybe even arrogance. Instead, the man who had just been described as a national hero went back to cleaning windows. She finally walked toward him. "I owe you an apology." Daniel kept cleaning. "You don't owe me anything. I mocked you. You judged what you could see. I was wrong. We're all wrong sometimes." His calm forgiveness caught her completely off guard. Most people would have enjoyed watching her apologize in front of everyone. Daniel didn't. He genuinely wanted to move on. That made Evelyn even more curious. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "What made a decorated army pilot become a janitor?" For the first time, Daniel stopped moving. He stared at the city skyline. His reflection shimmered in the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I promised someone I'd never fly again." Evelyn frowned. "Who?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his wallet. Inside was an old, worn photograph. The edges were faded. The colors had almost disappeared. It showed a smiling little girl sitting on his shoulders beside a helicopter. She couldn't have been older than 7. Daniel looked at the picture for only a second, before quietly placing it back inside his wallet. The smile that had briefly touched his face disappeared. Richard lowered his head. He already knew the story. The little girl had changed Daniel's life forever, and somewhere inside Hawthorne Aerospace, someone had just recognized the face in that old photograph. Someone had just recognized the face in that old photograph. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The entire rooftop had gone quiet, but Daniel's attention wasn't on the reporters or the executives. It was on the old photograph resting inside his wallet. The little girl's smile seemed frozen in time. A smile he hadn't seen in years. Inside the Hawthorne Aerospace headquarters, a woman in her late 60s stood near the executive lounge window, watching the commotion on the rooftop through the glass. Her name was Margaret Whitmore. She wasn't an employee. She was the company's largest shareholder. And Evelyn Carter's grandmother. Margaret narrowed her eyes when Daniel briefly held up the faded photograph. She suddenly froze. "No." She whispered, "That can't be." Without saying another word, she hurried toward the private elevator leading to the rooftop. Back on the helipad, reporters continued firing questions. "Captain Brooks, what happened to your daughter? Why did you quit flying? Were you injured?" Daniel answered none of them. He simply closed his wallet. "I'm sorry. I don't discuss my family." His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. Very tired. Richard stepped forward. "Everyone. I think that's enough." But reporters weren't ready to stop. One young journalist asked the question no one else dared to. "If you were America's best rescue pilot, why are you cleaning floors?" Daniel looked around the rooftop. Then he smiled gently. "Because every honest job has dignity." The sentence hit the crowd harder than anyone expected. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about that little girl in the photograph. Something about Daniel's expression. It wasn't regret, it was grief. the kind of grief that never truly leaves. She walked closer. You made a promise. Daniel nodded. I did. To your daughter? Daniel looked away. Yes. What kind of promise? He hesitated, then quietly answered. That she'd never have to watch another helicopter disappear into the sky. Evelyn frowned. I don't understand. Daniel took a slow breath. There was a time when I loved flying more than anything. I volunteered for missions no one else wanted. I believed I could save everyone. His eyes drifted toward the helicopter sitting only a few yards away. But life has a way of reminding you that you can't. Richard lowered his head. He already knew what was coming. He had heard the story years ago, but it still hurt. Daniel continued. 10 years ago. I came home from a rescue deployment. My daughter ran into my arms. She asked me one question. His voice cracked for the first time. Daddy, do helicopters always bring people home? The rooftop remained completely silent. Daniel forced a small smile. I told her. They try. He looked down at his hands. 3 months later. I was called out again. It was supposed to be a routine mountain rescue. The weather changed. Everything changed. I made it home. He swallowed hard. My best friend didn't. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Daniel wasn't crying, not anymore. He had cried enough years ago. When I got home, my daughter hugged me and asked if helicopters were dangerous. I lied. I told her no. A long silence followed. She believed me. Evelyn listened carefully. Something still didn't make sense. If you survived, why stop flying? Daniel looked toward the horizon. Because 2 years later. She didn't. The words barely left his mouth, but they crushed everyone who heard them. Evelyn's eyes widened. Daniel continued quietly. She wasn't in a helicopter. It was leukemia. We fought for 18 months. We tried every treatment. Every hospital. Every specialist. He smiled sadly. She was the bravest person I've ever known. Richard looked away. Even he couldn't bear to watch. The night before she passed away. She asked me something. Daniel's voice had become almost a whisper. Daddy, will you stay with me now? I told her. Always. She smiled and asked me not to leave again. So, I retired. I never flew another helicopter. No one on the rooftop moved. The arrogant jokes from earlier now felt shameful. The same people who had laughed at the janitor couldn't even look him in the eyes. Even Evelyn struggled to speak. I'm so sorry. Daniel gave her the same calm smile. It happened a long time ago. But grief doesn't care about calendars. Just then, one of Hawthorne Aerospace's flight engineers burst through the rooftop door, completely out of breath. Evelyn. She turned. What is it? The emergency medical helicopter heading to Children's Memorial Hospital. Just lost its primary pilot. The rooftop instantly became tense. The replacement pilot is still 40 minutes away. The helicopter is carrying a donor heart. If it doesn't leave in the next 15 minutes, a 12-year-old boy waiting for surgery won't survive. Everyone instinctively looked at the helicopter. Then, slowly, every pair of eyes turned toward Daniel. He stood perfectly still. His promise echoed inside his mind. Never fly again. But somewhere across the city, a child was waiting for a heart that might never arrive. And for the first time in 10 years, Daniel looked at a helicopter, not with memories, but with a choice. The rooftop fell into complete silence. No one dared to speak. The emergency flight engineer stood frozen, his face pale. The donor heart has already been packed, he said, struggling to catch his breath. Traffic has shut down every major highway after the bridge accident. Air transport is the only option. Evelyn looked toward her flight crew. Where's Captain Lewis? He collapsed with acute appendicitis 20 minutes ago. The backup, still outside the city. ETA, 42 minutes. Evelyn closed her eyes. The organ preservation clock was already ticking. Every minute mattered. The engineer swallowed hard. The hospital says the recipient is a 12-year-old boy. If the heart doesn't arrive in time. He couldn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood across the rooftop. Every eye slowly turned toward Daniel. He didn't move. He simply stared at the helicopter. For 10 years, he had avoided even sitting inside one. Now fate had brought him back to the same machine he had sworn never to touch again. Richard quietly stepped beside him. You don't have to do this. Daniel nodded. I know. No one would blame you. I know. Richard lowered his voice. You kept your promise. Daniel remained silent, did he? Or had he only hidden from the pain? He wasn't sure anymore. Meanwhile, Evelyn walked closer for the first time that day. There wasn't a trace of arrogance left in her voice. I'm not asking as your CEO. She paused. I'm asking as one human being to another. If there's any chance you can save that little boy. Please. Daniel looked at her. She wasn't challenging him anymore. She wasn't mocking him. She was pleading. There was a world of difference. Daniel slowly reached into his wallet. He pulled out the faded photograph of his daughter. Her bright smile stared back at him. He whispered so softly that only he could hear it. Emily, I told you I'd never fly again. A gentle breeze moved across the rooftop. His thumb brushed over the tiny photograph. Then another memory surfaced. Emily, lying in a hospital bed, weak but smiling anyway. She had squeezed his hand and whispered, Daddy, you always help people. Promise you'll never stop being you. Daniel suddenly realized something. He had remembered only half of her last wish. For 10 years, he had focused on the words, stay with me. But he had buried the rest. Don't stop helping people. His eyes slowly closed. A tear escaped before he quietly smiled. I've been keeping the wrong promise. He placed the photograph back into his wallet, then looked at Evelyn. Where's the donor hospital? St. Michael's Medical Center. And the recipient? Children's Memorial. Distance, 112 miles. Daniel looked toward the western sky. Dark storm clouds were beginning to roll in. The weather window closes in 25 minutes. The flight crew looked at him in surprise. He had estimated the weather almost instantly. Daniel calmly walked toward the helicopter. Every reporter instinctively followed. Hundreds of phones were now recording, not because of a marriage challenge, because something extraordinary was about to happen. Daniel stopped beside the aircraft. He gently rested one hand on the fuselage. For a moment, it felt like greeting an old friend. He climbed into the cockpit. The movements were effortless, natural. Muscle memory never truly disappears. He adjusted the seat, checked the instruments. Battery, fuel, rotor, brake, navigation. Hydraulic pressure, every switch, every gauge, every procedure, perfect, Frank whispered. He's faster than our senior pilots. Even Evelyn couldn't believe what she was watching. Daniel wasn't searching for controls. He already knew where every single one was. He removed his headset. This helicopter isn't cleared. The engineers looked confused. What? The right fuel filter warning was reset, but not repaired. One mechanic's face immediately turned white. How did you know? Daniel pointed toward the maintenance log on the tablet. It was signed, but never verified. The mechanic slowly lowered his head. He had skipped the final inspection to save time. Evelyn's expression hardened. We'll discuss that later. Daniel climbed back out. Give me another aircraft. There isn't one, the engineer replied. Daniel looked around, then toward an older rescue helicopter parked near the maintenance hangar. That one. Everyone stared. That helicopter was scheduled for retirement. Daniel smiled. So was I. 20 minutes later, the older aircraft roared to life. Its engines echoed across the city skyline. Daniel tightened his shoulder harness. Richard leaned through the cockpit door. You know, they'll probably offer you every aviation job in America after today. Daniel smiled. I'm not looking for another career. Richard nodded. I know. The rotors accelerated. The helicopter slowly lifted off the rooftop. Everyone watched in complete silence, especially Evelyn. She remembered her own words from less than an hour earlier. Fly this helicopter, and I'll marry you. Back then, she thought it was impossible. Now, she watched the quiet janitor disappear into the clouds, carrying the only chance a 12-year-old boy had to live. And deep inside, she realized this was never about a helicopter. It was about the kind of man Daniel Brooks had always been. But the most unbelievable part of his story was still waiting on the ground. The most unbelievable part of his story was still waiting on the ground. The retired rescue helicopter climbed steadily above the city skyline. Dark storm clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the last rays of the evening sun. Inside the cockpit, Daniel Brooks looked exactly as he had years ago. Calm, focused, completely in control. The radio suddenly crackled. Rescue 7, this is Metro Air Traffic Control. Severe storm cells developing along your flight path. Recommend delaying departure. Daniel glanced at the weather radar. No delay. If I wait, a 12-year-old boy loses his chance. There was a brief silence. Then the controller replied, "Understood, Captain." For the first time in 10 years, someone had called him Captain again. At Children's Memorial Hospital, doctors stood around an operating table. 12-year-old Noah Parker had already been placed under anesthesia. His mother, Sarah, sat outside the operating room, clutching a small stuffed bear. The transplant surgeon walked over. "We're running out of time." She nodded through tears. "I know. Please, tell me the helicopter is coming." The surgeon looked away. "We're hoping." Hope, that was all anyone had left, back at Hawthorne Aerospace. Nobody had gone home. Employees who had never spoken to Daniel gathered in the rooftop control room, watching the helicopter's location move across the radar screen. Even the reporters had stopped chasing headlines. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was real life. Evelyn stood quietly beside Margaret. Her grandmother smiled gently. "You judged him the way the world judges most people." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I know." Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "Real character almost never wears expensive clothes. It usually wears work boots." Inside the helicopter, rain slammed against the windshield. Lightning flashed only a few miles away. The aircraft shook violently. Richard's voice came over the radio. "Daniel, you can still turn back." Daniel smiled. "I've turned back once already. I'm not doing it again." He carefully guided the helicopter between two massive storm cells. Years of experience made impossible decisions look effortless. Every movement was smooth, every correction precise. Every second mattered. 28 minutes later, the helicopter landed on the rooftop of St. Michael's Medical Center. A transplant team was already waiting. The medical container carrying the donor heart was loaded in less than 90 seconds. A nurse looked at Daniel. "Thank you." He simply nodded. "Let's save a little boy." The helicopter lifted off again. The return flight proved even worse. Visibility dropped. Heavy rain covered the windshield. Then, a warning light illuminated the instrument panel. Engine temperature. Daniel immediately adjusted power settings. Another warning appeared. Crosswinds increased. Any ordinary pilot would have panicked. Daniel didn't. He remembered every lesson he'd ever taught younger pilots. The helicopter listens to your hands. If you're afraid, it becomes afraid too. He steadied the controls, slowly. The warnings disappeared minutes later. The lights of Children's Memorial Hospital appeared through the rain. The rooftop landing team cheered as the helicopter touched down. The donor heart reached the operating room with less than 4 minutes remaining. 6 hours later, the sun rose over the city. Doctors finally walked into the waiting room. Sarah immediately stood. The surgeon smiled. The surgery was successful. She covered her face and burst into tears. "My son is going to live." "Yes, he has a healthy heartbeat." Across the room, Daniel quietly smiled. Nobody noticed. He slipped out before anyone could thank him. He had never helped people for applause. Later that morning, Daniel returned to Hawthorne Aerospace, still wearing the same Navy janitor uniform, still pushing the same yellow cleaning cart. Employees stopped working as he entered the lobby. One by one, people stood. No one said a word. Then, someone began clapping. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire building erupted into applause. Executives, receptionists, mechanics, security guards, even reporters. Every person in the lobby stood on their feet. Daniel looked embarrassed. "You don't have to do this." Frank smiled. "We're not doing it because you flew a helicopter. We're doing it because you reminded us what kind of man we should all try to become." Evelyn slowly walked toward him. This time, there were no cameras, no reporters, no investors, just two people. She looked directly into his eyes. "I owe you more than an apology." Daniel smiled. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." She took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I thought success was measured by titles." She looked around the lobby. "Today I realized it's measured by character." She handed him a small envelope. "I'd like you to become director of flight operations." Daniel looked at the envelope, then quietly handed it back. "I appreciate it, but that's not where I'm supposed to be." Evelyn looked surprised. "You don't want the job." "I've spent years chasing titles. I don't need another one." So what do you want? Daniel smiled. I'd like to keep cleaning. Everyone looked confused. He continued. But I'd also like to start a scholarship for children who dream of becoming rescue pilots and for families who can't afford flight training. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. We'll fund every dollar. Margaret smiled proudly. And we'll name it after Emily. For the first time in years, Daniel couldn't hold back his emotions. He looked toward the morning sky. Soft clouds drifted across the horizon. He smiled through tears. She would have liked that. 3 months later, the Emily Brooks Rescue Aviation Foundation opened its doors. Young men and women from ordinary families began receiving scholarships to become emergency rescue pilots. On the entrance wall, a bronze plaque carried a simple quote from Daniel Brooks. The greatest flight you'll ever take isn't toward the sky, it's toward someone who needs you. Evelyn often visited the foundation, not because of the promise she had jokingly made on the rooftop. Some promises are born from pride, others from respect. She and Daniel became close friends, united by a shared mission to save lives through aviation. As for Daniel, every morning before the first students arrived, he still walked through the hangar with a broom in his hand. Not because he had to, because he believed no honest work was ever beneath a person of true character. And every student who asked why the founder sometimes cleaned the floors received the same answer. A uniform tells people what you do. Character tells them who you are. Character tells them who you are.